in the quiet English countryside of 1801, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, lived the Jude family. Their cottage, a humble structure of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof, nestled within a small, tenant farm. To the wider world, they were but a single, unremarkable dot on the vast map of the British Empire, a great and powerful entity whose glory and strife felt 1,000 leagues away. But within their small world, they were a universe unto themselves. At the head of this universe was Jude, a man with hands gnarled and strong from a lifetime of tilling the soil. His face, etched with lines of worry and wisdom, was as familiar to his wife Elara as the fields they worked. Elara was the soul of the home, her nimble fingers able to coax a meal from almost nothing and mend a tear in a garment with invisible stitches. They had 2 children, Thomas, a boy of 10, with a spirit as restless as the wind, and Mary, his younger sister, whose quiet eyes held the deep stillness of a calm river. Their days were a repetitive, yet sacred, dance with the seasons. The sun was their clock, the moon their gentle guide. In the dawn's cold light, Jude and Thomas would be out. Thomas carrying a small hoe he had painstakingly whittled himself, his father teaching him to read the land as if it were a book. They would turn the soil, sow the seeds of wheat and barley, and pray for rain that wasn't a downpour, and sun that wasn't a scorching fire. The land was not their own, but rented from a distant lord they had never met, a fact that hung over their lives like a perpetual cloud, reminding them that their very existence was a privilege that could be revoked. The distant world, with its grand wars and royal decrees, touched their lives in subtle, often painful, ways. News of the Napoleonic Wars reached them through the occasional passing traveler or at the weekly market. It was a distant rumble, yet it was the reason the price of flour rose. The reason young men from neighboring villages were called away to a war they didn't understand. The royal family, a constellation of faces on coins and distant whispers of grandeur, existed in a different dimension. They were a remote, powerful force. Their behavior towards poor farmers, like the Judes, a matter of complete and utter indifference. The only way they knew to travel was in their trusty wooden cart. Jude had built it himself with great care, its sturdy wheels and simple frame designed for the rough, muddy tracks that served as roads. The cart was a testament to his craftsmanship, its joints secured with wooden pegs and bound with thick rope. It was used to take their small surplus to the market in the nearby town of Littlemore, a journey that felt like a grand expedition and took the better part of a day. This market was their only window to a world beyond their fields. They would trade a few bushels of grain, some of Ilara's preserved jams, or a basket of eggs for salt, a new length of linen, or a much-needed tool. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of crimson and gold, the family gathered around their hearth. Elara served a simple stew of potatoes and onions from their garden, accompanied by a small loaf of dark, dense bread. The meal was sparse, but warm and nourishing. After they ate, Jude sat with Thomas and Mary, whittling a small wooden bird for Mary, his rough hands moving with surprising delicacy. Elara sat nearby, mending a tear in Thomas's worn wool jacket. The flickering firelight danced across their faces, illuminating their quiet love and shared hopes. In this moment, the worries of the world, the distant wars, and the hard toil of the land seemed to fade away. It was a time of simple, profound peace. Jude looked at his wife and children, his heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. The world was hard, but as long as they had each other, they had everything. The shadows of war, 1808. The years that followed felt like the turning of a great, heavy wheel, each revolution bringing with it new burdens and tests. By 1808, the Napoleonic Wars had tightened their grip on England, and the distant rumble of cannons was now felt in the very bellies of the common people. A series of poor harvests, combined with the blockades and trade disruptions of the war, sent the price of grain soaring. For the Jude family, this was a hardship more tangible than any distant battle. Thomas was now a lanky young man of 17, his boyish frame having stretched and hardened with the endless labor of the fields. Mary, a quiet and observant girl of 14, was becoming Alara's right hand. Her small hands, as skilled with a needle and thread as her mother's. Their diet, always simple, grew even more sparse. The precious wheat they grew was no longer for their own consumption but for trade, its value too great to be eaten. Their meals now consisted of thick, heavy oatcakes, boiled greens from their small garden, and a watery soup made from whatever they could forage from the hedgerows. Meat was a distant memory, a luxury enjoyed only on rare occasions or in the stew pots of the wealthy. The joy of a full belly was a rare visitor to their home. The stark reality of their place in the world was brought home one sweltering summer's day. A new land agent, a cold and sharp-featured man named Mr. Finch, arrived on horseback to collect the rent. Unlike the previous, more lenient agent, he was a man of business, not of the land. He spoke not of crops or weather, but of ledgers and profit margins. "The Lord requires his due," he said with an air of finality, his eyes sweeping over their humble cottage with thinly veiled disdain. "The war has raised his costs, and so, too, will your rent be raised." The new demand was a blow that stole the air from Jude's lungs. It was an impossible sum, and it was a cold, hard reminder that they were mere cogs in a machine of wealth they would never understand. The royal family, King George III, a figure of distant veneration and little else, was utterly divorced from the desperate struggles of families like theirs. The king's madness was a story told in the local tavern, but his suffering was a curiosity, not a shared hardship. Their own suffering, the gnawing hunger and the endless toil, was a private matter, unseen and unheard by the great and powerful. To make ends meet, Jude worked even longer hours, his body aching with a constant, weary protest. He spent the late nights repairing the old cart, strengthening its frame and replacing its worn parts. Thomas, now strong enough to lift the heavy planks, worked alongside him. Their rhythmic hammering acquired him to their shared struggle. Thomas learned from his father not just how to build, but how to endure, how to find strength in purpose. In turn, Alara began to take on spinning and mending work from the more prosperous families in the village, her fingers working tirelessly by the light of a single tallow candle after the children were asleep. Mary helped her, learning to card the raw wool and turn it into thread, their quiet collaboration a form of comfort. The moral compass of their family was a simple one: survive with dignity, and never forget the love that bound them together. One evening, after another day of endless toil, Jude sat with his family, the flickering flame of the hearth casting long shadows on their faces. "We will get through this," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The land may be harsh, and the world may be distant, but our strength is here, in this room." He gestured to each of them. "We are a family, and that is a wealth no lord or king can take from us." It was a simple truth, a heart-touching moment of shared resolve that nourished them more than any meal ever could. By 1815, the world outside their quiet valley, once a distant rumor, came crashing down with a roar that echoed across the nation. News of Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo spread like wildfire, carried by weary soldiers returning home and by the shouts of triumph in distant towns. The village celebrated with bonfires and ale, a temporary joy born of relief. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that the hard years were behind them. But for Jude and his family, the end of the war brought a different, more insidious kind of hardship. The end of the war saw a flood of grain imports from Europe, causing a dramatic and brutal collapse in prices. The small surplus they had painstakingly cultivated and protected now fetched a pittance, the very thing they had hoped would bring them security. The bountiful harvest had become a curse. Parliament, in a move meant to protect the powerful landowners from this economic downturn, passed the infamous Corn Laws that same year. These laws blocked the import of cheap foreign grain, artificially keeping the price of bread painfully high. To the Jude family, and to millions of others, this felt like a betrayal. The royal family and the government seemed to be playing a game of wealth and power, while the poor were crushed underfoot. They had survived the war, only to be defeated by peace. Thomas, now a strong, broad-shouldered man of 24, watched his father's spirit falter. Jude, his face a map of resignation and despair, would stand in the fields, his hands at his sides, the futility of his labor a heavy cloak upon him. The debt to the land agent grew, and the cottage seemed to hold its breath in a state of perpetual fear. Mary, her quiet strength growing with each year, tried to keep the family's spirits up, her gentle humor and unflagging work a steady comfort to her mother. She had become a master of making a meal out of almost nothing, her soups of nettles and wild mushrooms often the only sustenance for a full day. Their diet was a testament to their poverty. Gruel in the mornings, boiled roots for supper, and on a very rare occasion, a small piece of salted fish. It was one evening, as the last light faded from the sky, that Thomas spoke a thought that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Father," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "there is no future for me here. The soil gives, and then the prices take. I hear of work in the cities, the mills and factories. They need men. Hard men." Jude looked at his son, his heart twisting with a pain he had never known. The thought of his son leaving the land, leaving the rhythm of their lives, was a grief as profound as any death. For generations, their family had been of the land. To leave it was to lose a part of their very soul. But he looked into Thomas's eyes and saw not desperation, but a fierce determination born of love. Thomas was not seeking to escape. He was seeking to save them. The decision was a quiet, sorrowful one. Thomas would travel to the industrial heartland, to a place where the air was thick with smoke, and the ground trembled with the roar of machines. The journey itself was fraught with danger. The roads were rough. Travel was by foot or on crowded, bone-jarring wagons, and bandits were a constant threat. He would carry with him only a small bag with a change of clothes, a few pieces of bread, and his father's old pocket-knife, symbol of the life he was leaving behind. The night before his departure, the family gathered around the hearth, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alara held his face in her hands, her eyes filled with tears, while Mary stood close, her hand clutching his arm. Jude said nothing, but his hand on his son's shoulder was a language of its own, a silent testament to his pride and his sorrow. In that moment, Thomas was no longer just a son. He was their hope, a moral beacon stepping into an unknown world to save the ones he loved. The city of smoke. The year is 1828, and Thomas has been swallowed by the Industrial Revolution. He works in a cotton mill, a place of deafening noise and flying fibers that choke the air. For 12 or 16 hours a day, he stands amidst the towering looms, his body aching, his mind numb. The money he earns is a lifeline, though a pitiful wage for backbreaking labor. But it allows him to send something home. Back in the quiet valley, a letter from Thomas is a precious thing, written slowly on a borrowed quill. They tell of his struggles and his triumphs, his hopes and his dreams. The family gathers around as Alara reads his words aloud. In their cramped home, his words are a lifeline, a connection to the son they miss with a deep, abiding ache. The money Thomas sends allows his father to buy a new set of tools, and his mother to buy sacks of flour. Mary, his sister, blossoms into a gentle young woman, and the family's sorrow over Thomas's absence is eased by the hope that he is working towards a better life for them all. The homecoming 1840s. By the mid-1840s, a new queen named Victoria sat upon the throne. Her youth and quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the flamboyant monarchs who came before. Her reign was a new dawn for the British Empire, and for some, it carried a promise of reform and a fairer world. For Thomas Jude, now a man nearing his 40th year, this new era was a time for reckoning. The soot-stained air of the factory town had begun to feel like a cage. He had worked hard, saved every shilling he could, and a new plan had taken root in his heart, a plan to go home. He had enough to make a fresh start, not as a tenant farmer, but as a man with a small stake in his own future. His journey home was a marvel of the new age, a testament to how far the world had come since his departure. He did not walk or ride in a bone-jarring wagon. He traveled by rail. The locomotive, a monstrous creation of iron and steam, roared down the tracks with a power that left him awestruck. The world outside the train window was a blur, a dizzying landscape of fields and forests rushing past at speeds that were once unimaginable. This new form of travel was a symbol of the changing times, a bridge between the old agrarian world and the new industrial one. As the train slowed to a stop at the nearest station, a new kind of air filled his lungs, clean, cold, and smelling of damp earth. The scent alone was a homecoming. He walked the last few miles, his steps quickening as familiar landmarks came into view. The stone wall of the old church, the winding path by the river, the great oak tree that marked the edge of his father's land. His heart hammered in his chest with a mix of fear and desperate hope. He found the cottage, smaller than he remembered, a wisp of smoke rising from its chimney, just as it always had. He pushed open the gate, his hand trembling. The sound of his father's voice, a little older and rougher, carried on the breeze. He saw his mother, Elara, seated by the door, her hair now a silvery gray, her hands still busy with mending. And then he saw Mary. She was no longer a girl, but a woman with a gentle face, holding a small boy in her arms. She had married William, the good-natured farmer's son, and their quiet life had been blessed. A stillness fell over the yard as they saw him. For a moment, no one spoke. They looked at the stranger, with his city clothes, and his face lined with a decade of factory dust and hardship. But then, Elara's hand went to her mouth, and a sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her. "Thomas," she whispered. He said nothing, only dropped his bag and walked to her, a tear tracking a clean line down his sooty cheek. He knelt before his mother and took her worn hands in his. Jude, standing by the shed, his body a little stooped, his hands on his hips, watched with a quiet strength. There was no need for words. The sight of his son, alive and home, was enough. The reunion was a powerful, silent language of love and sacrifice. Over a humble meal that evening, Thomas spoke of his plan. He had saved enough to purchase the small cottage and the land outright from the Lord's agent, finally freeing them from the constant threat of tenancy. He also had enough to invest in a small, independent venture, carpentry business, using the skills he'd honed, building carts, and the discipline he'd learned in the city. The factory had taken a part of his body and his spirit, but it had also forged him into a man capable of seizing his own destiny. The love of his family was the moral compass that had guided him through the darkness, and their reunion was the most precious treasure of all. A new kind of prosperity. 1850s. The mid-1850s found the Jude family in a state of quiet, hard-won contentment. The decades of scarcity and fear had given way to a period of gentle prosperity, not of great wealth, but of security. Thomas's carpentry business flourished. His reputation for honest work and skilled hands spread throughout the valley and into the nearby town. He built sturdy carts and wagons that were stronger and lighter than any made before, and his hand-carved furniture, with its simple elegance, was sought after by the more prosperous families. The income from his trade, combined with the continued yield of the land, ensured that the family never again had to face the gnawing fear of hunger. Their diet, once a grim testament to poverty, now held small luxuries. The family table, a sturdy creation by Thomas himself, was often laden with thick, fresh-baked bread, a joint of roasted meat on Sundays, and a variety of vegetables from their now expansive garden. Elara, her hands finally free from the constant burden of mending for others, spent her days preserving jams and chutneys, their sweet smell a joyful scent in the cottage. The world outside, however, was still a place of distant conflict. News of the Crimean War reached the village, carried on the newly laid telegraph wires, and reported in newspapers that, while still a luxury, were now more accessible. The Crimean War, a conflict far from their shores, was brought home in the form of casualty lists and tales of heroic nurses like Florence Nightingale. The boys who went to fight were from neighboring towns, and their distant fate served as a somber reminder that peace was a fragile gift. The reigning monarch, Queen Victoria, and her husband, Prince Albert, were now figures of great public fascination. The old days of remote, almost mythical kings were gone. Instead, The country was presented with a virtuous, loving family, their lives and their many children, a constant source of news and moral guidance. For the Jude family, the Queen's image offered a new kind of hope. Her family's devotion to one another resonated with their own deep-seated values. The crown was no longer just a symbol of power, but also, in a way, a symbol of the family ideal they held so dear. The greatest joy of this new era, however, was in the passing of time and the growth of the next generation. Mary and William now had a small flock of their own children, a boisterous brood who filled the cottage with their laughter and games. The eldest, a boy named Samuel, showed a keen interest in his grandfather's farming and his uncle's carpentry, a perfect blend of the family's legacy. One peaceful evening, as the sun cast a golden light over the fields, Jude sat with his wife on the small stone bench outside their cottage. They watched as Thomas helped his nephew, Samuel, learn to whittle a piece of wood, his gnarled hand gently guiding the boys. Alara smiled, her face filled with a serene calm that had been a long time coming. "Look at them," she whispered, her voice soft with emotion. "Our lives. They were so hard, but it was not for nothing. They have a future." Jude simply nodded, his eyes filled with unshed tears. He remembered the gnawing hunger, the worry of the next harvest, the pain of sending his son away. All of it had been worth it. Their love, their sacrifice, and their quiet endurance had not just saved their family. It had built a foundation of peace and security for generations to come. The 1890s arrived, bringing with them a final, grand flourish of the Victorian era. It was a time of immense national pride, and the British Empire, now a vast, interconnected web spanning the globe, felt invincible. In the quiet valley, the village was no longer isolated. The railway, now a staple of life, brought not only goods and news, but also a steady influx of new ideas and a different rhythm of life. The greatest celebration of the decade was the Diamond Jubilee in 1897, marking Queen Victoria's 60 years on the throne. Even in their small village, the occasion was met with a joyous fervor. There were flags and bunting, a communal feast on the village green, and a bonfire that blazed high into the night sky, its light visible for miles. The Queen, now a near mythical figure of immense age and dignity, was revered not just as a monarch, but as the matriarch of the nation. For the Jude family, the Jubilee was a time for reflection. Jude and Alara were both gone now, their long, hard-working lives ending in the peace and security they had fought so hard to create. Their cottage, now a family heirloom, was cared for by their daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, who continued to tend the farm, though the old ways were slowly giving way to the new. Thomas, now a respected master carpenter, still created his beautiful, sturdy furniture. But the demand for his traditional carts had waned. The age of the horse-drawn wagon was coming to an end. The most shocking and symbolic change was the arrival of the first motorcar in the valley. It came on a hot summer's day, a noisy, clanking contraption of steel and leather that belched black smoke and terrified the horses. It was a strange and unsettling sight, a machine that moved with a terrifying independence, its loud horn shattering the peaceful stillness of the countryside. The villagers gathered to gawk at it, some with awe, some with fear, and others with a deep sense of unease. Samuel, now a foreman on the railway, watched with a quiet understanding. He was a man of the new age, a product of the very progress that was now changing his home. He was a testament to his family's journey, a man who understood the language of both the soil and the machine. He had seen the poverty that had haunted his grandfather's youth, and he had seen the triumph of his family through their hard work and love. He knew that the world would never stop changing, and the key to survival was not to resist, but to adapt while holding fast to the values that mattered. One evening, as he sat in the cottage that his grandfather had built, he looked at his own children playing in the yard. They would never know the hunger or the fear that had defined their ancestors' lives. They would take for granted the iron road, the steady wage, and the comforts that had been luxuries to Jude and Alara. The moral lesson was clear. Prosperity, when earned through honest labor and sacrifice, was a treasure to be cherished, not just for the material comforts it provided, but for the freedom it gave to live with dignity. The old world was fading, its colors muted by the new age of industry and technology. But the spirit of the Jude family, their quiet resilience, and their profound love for one another, was a flame that burned ever brighter, passed from one generation to the next. The year was 1902, and the world had breathed a collective sigh of relief as the distant Boer War came to an end. A new era, the Edwardian Age, had begun, with King Edward VII now on the throne. The village, once so remote, was now a bustling part of a changing nation. The old Jude cottage, a sentinel to a century of history, stood as a testament to the family's journey. Inside, the last of the old guard, Mary and Thomas, sat by the hearth, their faces illuminated by the dancing firelight. They were old now, their bodies carrying the weight of 100 years of change, but their spirits remained bright. The old wooden cart, now a relic, sat in the corner of the shed, its wheels no longer turning on the muddy lanes. In its place, Thomas had built a small, elegant cart for pleasure rides, its wheels wrapped in a new material called rubber. The family no longer needed it for survival, but kept it as a physical reminder of their past. Mary's son, Samuel, now a respected leader in the community, had a home of his own, with a small but comfortable garden. His children, the great-grandchildren of Jude, lived a life of relative ease, their childhoods a world away from the grinding poverty of their ancestors. One evening, as a new century's moon cast its gentle light over the fields, Samuel sat with his mother and uncle. They spoke of the world that was, and the world that had been. They talked of the days of their grandfather, Jude, when the simple act of putting food on the table was an act of triumph. They spoke of the sheer will it took for Jude to build his cart with his own two hands, and for Thomas to endure the factories to save them all. It was a story of a single family, yet it was also the story of a nation transforming itself. The journey of the Jude family from 1801 to 1902 was a microcosm of the British Empire itself, a journey from a rural, agrarian society to a bustling, industrial powerhouse. Their simple life had been a canvas for the grand strokes of history. They had witnessed the rise of industry, the reign of a great queen, the miracle of the railway, and the jarring arrival of the motor car. But through all the change, the things that truly mattered remained constant. The love of a family, the dignity of honest work, and the unwavering belief in a better tomorrow. The story was not just one of survival, but one of moral courage. It was the story of Jude, who taught his children the value of the land. It was the story of Alara, whose quiet strength was the soul of the home. It was the story of Thomas, whose sacrifice built a new future, and of Mary, who kept the heart of the family beating. And it was the story of every generation since, who carried those values forward, no matter how the world around them changed. As they sat by the fire, a peaceful silence fell over them. The old cottage, with its thatched roof and solid walls, felt like a living thing, filled with a century of memories. The legacy of Jude was not a name on a plaque or a line of wealth, but the enduring spirit that had carried his family through the darkness and into the light. Their hearts were full, and their story, a heart-touching tale of resilience and love, had reached its peaceful end. Thank you, dear listeners, for following the story of the Jude family. It has been a privilege to share this tale of hardship, hope, and the quiet triumph of a simple family. If this story touched your heart as it did mine, I hope you will cherish the morals it holds and share it with those you love.